Hello and welcome to a special edition of The Intelligent Community, the podcast of the Intelligent Community Forum. My name is Matthew Owen, and I'm the Executive Director of ICF and the host of today's episode. The title of this episode is Broadband Today, Where Are We? And this is the first in a series of quarterly discussions we'll be having with the three founders of the Intelligent Community Forum, discussing the status of the intelligent community movement, as well as the challenges, opportunities, and successes of leading intelligent communities around the world. But before we welcome the co-founders and get into our conversation, I do want to update you on some of the happenings with ICF. As you may already know, ICF has announced its Smart 21 Communities of 2023, the semifinalists in the year-long search to name an Intelligent Community of the Year. This year's list features communities from 8 countries spread over 5 continents and can be found at www.icfsmart21.com. After another round of evaluation, 7 of these Smart 21 will be named the top 7 intelligent communities of the year at a conference and announcement taking place on the 20th of June in the Durham region, Ontario, Canada. More information on this event will be released by ICF soon. And with that, I would like to welcome Robert Bell, Lou Zacharilla, and Jung, the 3 founders of ICF, for today's discussion. Gentlemen, welcome.
Hey, Matt.
How you doing?
Hi there.
Well, it's good to have you guys here with us today. And the first thing I do want to ask, it's the title of our show. It's Broadband. Where are we? So where are we today with broadband in the intelligent community movement? Robert?
Well, we came out of COVID, didn't we? And COVID, for all of its horrors, had one very, very positive effect, which is it put to rest any discussion about whether broadband mattered and whether broadband was an important part of our economy, an important part of society, even an important part of culture. And the answer is all of those are yes. And of course, that's something we've been talking about for about 20 years, but it really came true in this tough period we went through.
Yeah, I agree. And when you look around the world, and I live in Canada, and so I'm going to reflect a little bit about Canada, but looking around the world, most communities going through COVID experienced this need to connect. And what better way to connect than through things like this program here, Zoom, that we're using. I had a Zoom call with all my family members. And frankly, when we stopped a couple of months ago, I feel we actually lost something. So COVID, in a way, created and accelerated a lot of different ways in which people communicated and connected. Schools and strategic planning and cities all have developed a new direction that is probably as much as 10 years ahead, given the fact that they went through COVID and had to experience this with their students and with municipal employees and so forth. So it actually is a yin and yang thing, isn't it? There were good things about it and there were terrible things about it. Lou, what do you think?
Yeah, I'll focus on the terrible things. You're right, John, Robert. We wrote a book in 2008 called Broadband Economies, where we kind of looked ahead and actually saw this. And I think you're right, John, that the things that were on the planning boards that might not have happened for 15 or 20 years got accelerated because we realized how important it was. So I think that was important. But, over 1 million people died in the United States. And there were consequences. Our healthcare system proved to be very, very vulnerable at certain levels. So those are things we need to clean up. And it revealed a lot about our societies. One of the things that I'll stay positive for a second. One of the things I liked was that it proved one of my pet projects, the universal basic income, kind of worked. People always say the government shouldn't give people money, shouldn't do this, shouldn't do that. But when those monies became available, they fundamentally sustained the economy, but they also allowed people to explore things like new opportunities, new ways to maybe create careers. There was a lot of quiet quitting that went on, and people were supported in ways that the advocates of universal basic income had always anticipated, Andrew Yang and those guys. So there was a little bit of that. So there's a lot of social experimentation, but what I really found unnerving was some of the statistics on mental health. What we see out there, the breakdown, the rates of suicide, the rises in crime that we've seen, just this sort of breakdown in many areas of our society that I think you could probably connect to the pandemic, but also increasingly to the lack of broadband access. So I think the question of whether we need broadband or not, as you guys have said, kind of got washed away. The question now is, what's it look like when we get it in there, and how are we going to take what was revealed about our societies that were very, very negative and begin to repair our societies? And interestingly enough, Matt, to the point of the new Smart 21, a lot of them have sort of picked up on this and have built societies or communities rather that I think we can continue to study and look at as maybe models of the future.
So at this point, with all the changes that you've seen, would you say that a lot of the naysayers have caught up on the idea of the importance of broadband to a community? And do you think that this has accelerated a lot of the trends that may have been happening pre-COVID?
It's interesting. I mean, Lou was talking about the terrible things that happened in the pandemic that were not about the pandemic, right? They were not direct health impacts of the pandemic. I've been thinking a lot recently about change. Change is something that human beings detest at a fundamental level. It makes them feel uncertain. It makes them feel afraid. It's amazing the power of it to disturb us. And so, in addition to the direct impacts of COVID, change itself is, what's behind so much of that crime, so much of mental health problems and so forth. It's that inability, and people were left exposed, and they knew they were left exposed because they didn't have the connectivity that they had. The have and have not, of course, Lou and I are both Americans, right? So the have and the have not is very stark here in America. And that divide was so dramatic, and so, yes, I think that all of the communities, in fact, we interviewed a bunch of mayors about, how's it going in COVID? And over again, it was, thank the Lord that we had sufficient connectivity to hold our people together. And I think that story has been repeated over and over and over and over again. So, yeah, nobody wants to say no, except somebody whose bottom line might depend upon not building a network.
Yeah, you might to pick up on that. You might also be seeing something that, again, we've been working toward, which is sort of a stabilization of the smaller and rural communities. Because again, people began to work home. They began to realize that they could work anywhere they wanted and call a place home. If the connectivity was there, they could maybe build from that. So I think we did see that, and that is also going to bring about significant changes, and it's going to impact the place where I live, New York City. I've seen that. I've seen what it's like now that people in the financial community and other communities can work in other places, and I think that's a change we don't really completely embrace yet. You've still got the commercial real estate industry and the mayor of New York saying we want people back to work. We want them in the buildings, and commercial real estate will come back. I'm not so sure. As a matter of fact, I'm pretty sure it won't. But again, as you said, Robert, these are people hanging on to the way things were, right, in 2019, thinking that somehow this was just something that was going to cycle through and that we were going to get back to the way we were, to borrow a movie title. But it never happens that way.
In my head, I've been discounting the commercial real estate industry for about 10 years, just waiting. And as always, things don't progress in any kind of orderly, simple manner on a nice curve. They go along, and then there's a huge, sharp change. John, I want to hear from you about this.
Yeah, but I've been traveling and seeing these changes in cities for more than a decade. Again, this is an acceleration that's occurred. So, for instance, in Melbourne, Australia, I spent quite a bit of time taking a look at their downtown area, and people were, obviously coming into the city center and going back out. They're starting to put in residential in the city center, but it's not like Toronto and some other cities where it's quite mixed. And what I was seeing was that a lot of those office buildings and even the universities like Remit and others, they were changing in how people were getting together. So 2015, the universities take out the seating and the classrooms and create these open areas with these moon chairs and all sorts of other things going on, and people were able to get together. If you go to Seattle and take a look at what Amazon built, they have this hub, with planting and everything else. And that's where people get together and meet. You go to Eindhoven and our friends at Brainport, their economic development facilities aren't offices. They're one large area with picnic tables and so forth where they could get together. So what I'm thinking is that even before COVID, there was a beginning of a mind change around built form and the use of these buildings as places to congregate and share ideas where people get together, but don't necessarily just go to a cubicle and huddle in and work from that particular device in that cubicle. My daughter works in a city hall that she doesn't go back to anymore for the last couple of years. And now they're trying to say, come back and you have to be in there for 2 or 3 days a week. She goes in there and they're not as equipped as she is at home. So she's much more productive at home, is forced to go in, can't really use the outdated equipment, but loves the idea of getting back together with all these people. Right. So I think that's what's going to happen with a lot of the offices. You're going to get a lot more residential built in those office spaces. That's already happening. And you're going to see office spaces in the central area, headquarters, being hubs where people come together. But you're going to get a lot of exurban, suburban, and even rural areas where people can go to some kind of a hub space and get together with people, but still be connected to their other people at headquarters and so forth. And then the rest of the time, they're going to be at home or on the beach or wherever there's connectivity and they could do their work from there. That's how we've been evolving for the last several decades. It's just that we're accelerating.
I'm really kind of curious. It's not going to happen anytime soon, but I'm really curious about how the office, the home is going to start evolving to assume that some of the people you're engaging with are not physically with you, right? I mean, you've probably seen some early designs for conference space. They're trying to figure out how to make the people who are remote have an equal presence to people who are that's going to be an interesting exploration, I think, for any community, for instance, that's trying to attract this generation of footloose people because they have talent and they do work that can be done remotely. How do you make your community, the different facilities of your community, truly remote friendly? Because they're not yet.
Well, they're actually perpetuating a form of loneliness. Senator Murphy in Connecticut, of course, was responding to the 67 mass shootings we've had this year in the United States. And they did a survey. 60% of teenagers reported intense loneliness. Mm-hmm. And that's ubiquitous across society, and social media and connectivity as a presumed replacement for the types of things John's talking about, not being together, not having the physical network, they suspect may be at the cause of it, maybe one of the causes of it. He's suggesting something different, or I think intriguing, which is do all the things you guys just talked about, because those changes are going to happen whether you like it or not. But he said, make sure that either at a policy level or at a personal level, you connect to one other organization in your community that's real, like your church, like some other social group. He said, but make it a commitment, or communities should make it a policy to enable those things in some of these empty spaces, and to look for that and to solidify that more with regard to putting back together the things that may have been lost. So that's a really intriguing idea. But the fact that he identified that problem is, as I say, a problem to be solved by communities.
That's interesting. That's actually one of the most classic pieces of advice for a happy life. You commit to one outside thing, an organization, become part of it, make it part of your identity. Interesting. But anyway, I think we've gone kind of a long way from broadband. We're certainly talking about connectivity, but not necessarily the digital kind.
Well, that actually brings me back to a follow-up item that I wanted to ask you, Robert, because you had mentioned that uh, one of the roadblocks for communities in terms of getting that broadband is maybe just not having the budget to put a project in place. But are there any other reasons that you think broadband is not still universally available? Is there still maybe not just a financial point, but are there still people who have not seen the light, who have not had that moment of truth where they understand the need for it? And if communities out there are listening, do have either it's other council members or other people within their community who are not yet understanding why broadband is so important, what can we tell them to help them understand?
Well, to really understand why this is important, you actually have to be a user. We can talk to you about it all day long, and you'll watch Netflix movies, but you won't necessarily think about that as being anything other than just TV. Once you use it, to solve some problems of yours, then you get it. I don't think that's the barrier, though, right? I mean, there's a generational shift. Obviously, young people are digital natives. People in my age range and older are not, and they either have adapted consciously or they have not. But it's more than anything else. It's just because we're in this awkward zone. We've been here at ICF, we've been talking about broadband connectivity as a fundamental utility like electricity, like water, for 20 years. And it's true, but guess what? It's not. It's a for-profit business, and regulated, but not very highly regulated from a price standpoint, for-profit business. And it runs on that basis. Why? That's how it started, and that's how it's going to keep going, except in those cases where in the past 20 years, we've begun to see a diversification of models. So now it's not just all private business. Some of it is public-private. Some of it is all public. I mean, our intelligent community in Westerville, Ohio, built a network and then built a data center. It's all owned by the government. It's all owned by the local, the taxpayers ultimately, and they've had huge economic impacts coming out of that. So that's a different model. So I think that the more flexibility we can provide for communities to do what it is they need to do, without, of course, destroying. We're not here to destroy the success of private enterprise. The more motivation the private enterprise will have to do what needs to be done. It's oftentimes when I'm speaking to groups, I'll say, you go to a place that's broadband challenged, and they can't get the ear. They're too small. They're a small market. They don't have the wealth. They can't get the attention of the incumbent telco or the incumbent cable company. Understandable. But if they do things to change the competitive dynamic, if they, for instance, build a government network, they just run some fiber to serve their own, their firehouse and their police station and so forth, great payback from that investment. But in addition, it absolutely, signals to the incumbent that, you don't own everything here. And there are going to be costs for you to not invest. So that's one of the things that we say to a lot of communities. You can always do something. You can always do something to change the competitive dynamic, because there's nothing better than getting somebody else to invest their dollars or their euros or their yen or whatever currency it is in your community.
Yeah, I agree. And the key there is use and application. But a lot of communities are desperate for it. So I'll give you a case in Canada. They had produced in November of 2020 during COVID a reaction to the whole need for broadband. They adopted a $1.75 billion universal broadband fund. And it's laying out now in one of the communities that applied for Smart 21 is Pictou County, and they were one of the winners. And what they did was they got, I think, $4 million or something from the government, and there was a kind of a matching fund that the county had to put in, and now they're underway. And so they've applied to us, and we'll be commenting on their development. But it's those people that Robert mentioned are not quite aware yet of how to use it. I go back to a story of LaGrange, Georgia, when we were first really pushing the intelligent community. And LaGrange was a great example. They had cable that they were putting in, and in those cable areas, they were also putting in fiber. And nobody knew what to do with this. And so the community got the local college to do a training on television of how to type in stuff. And the community was still not quite getting it. And they thought that they could post their, little products that they were making, sweaters they were knitting and drawings and whatever else on the internet. And they weren't realizing that it was going around the world. And all of a sudden, people in LaGrange were getting invitations to sell their products to Chicago and to Paris and elsewhere. And that's when they realized they learned how to attach a file and little things like that. And from that, e-commerce grew in LaGrange. And it was an amazing story back then. Not so great a story now, but maybe in some communities, that's how it has to start. It has to start from a need, education, and somebody out there helping them, holding their hand and giving them the opportunity to do what they want to do to make it successful in their communities.
Yeah, those are the nice outcomes of it. But, Robert was also, I think, drilling into a key issue that, we work on and we try to support, which is what is the role of the government to create that different looking competitive field, to move the incumbent aside, because it's easier said than done, because these guys spend a lot of money lobbying state legislatures. Dublin, Ohio is a great example, right? They built their own municipal fiber network, but they had to go to court, didn't they, to get that done? So there are a lot of challenges there. It was interesting. I was speaking with the state of Missouri. One of their I spoke to the legislature, but the individual legislator who's really driving this. And what he's looking at, and he's asking us about, are different models of new kinds of PPPs. It's like, how can I work with the private sector? Because I don't want to be the government. Now it's a conservative government down there. I don't want to be the government just coming in and telling people what to do. This is not the NBN or whatever in Australia necessarily. But he said, we have a role to play. We are an enabler. So what are the new models of public-private partnerships that we can put together where, as both you guys are saying, we can have everybody win and get this stuff in so that we can do things that we all know are necessary to move the societies forward.
We have a partner that a corporate partner, Lit Communities, that's their business model. They build networks, but they only do it as public-private partnerships because it addresses, John, the thing that you talked about. That community needs to work through the question of what are we going to do with this? Why are we doing this? What's the value? And to make that decision to commit, and then you can produce this network, which it needs to be cash flow positive. And it needs to deliver, high quality of service. You need to constantly, as our friend Rob McCann at Clear Cable will remind us, you have to constantly reinvest in it. But you can also think your plan can start not with bits and bytes and fibers and stuff. Your plan can start with how are we going to use this to improve education? How are we going to use this to increase our economic clout? How are we going to help our small business community use this? Right. Those are the things that ultimately we're talking about when we're talking about broadband. We're just not talking about watching Netflix.
Right. Focus on an achievable goal that benefits the entire society.
Yeah.
And you build that way. I'm wondering, because we've been talking about the triple helix. We know that the triple helix works in Vietnam. It's starting to work. It's transforming the economy there. Is there something within the triple helix that can make communities more aware of the benefits of broadband and therefore not having so much contention?
Well, you're talking about the triple helix, right? That is the idea that local government or government of some kind, the business community, and the educational community usually.
Yeah, or the intellectual class. Yeah.
Right. Get together and work the problem of what is it we need, and if we're going to entice business to come do something, how do we make sure that it has educational outcomes, it has government positive outcomes, it has social positive outcomes. It's a great approach to development of anything, really. And generally speaking, it's all about creating innovation, right? Because innovation is where 80% of all economic growth comes from. If you're not innovating, guess what? You chose to stick yourself with 20% of the available pot of economic growth. The work for, basically it's broadband, the people who know how to use it to make money, and the the environment, the ecosystem that helps them innovate to create greater prosperity in the community and to spread it as wide as possible. That's what we've been preaching for a long time, and we've seen it over and over and over again in places like from Eindhoven to Vietnam.
Yeah, but Matt, focusing on one goal, right? Like being named an intelligent community or something like that is probably
one area
one way
that
to do this.
one area that both public-private partnerships and the triple helix is missing is the people first perspective, and so it should actually be a quadruple helix, first of all.
Yeah.
And public-private partnerships need to address the inclusive engagement of everybody. And oftentimes government isn't good enough at engaging and ensuring that there's inclusive, open, accountable and very accessible means of engaging the public. So it's the public piece of that in the PPP that really often fails, and I think where it becomes important is to know what you actually want to do with it, and it's that inclusiveness and that engagement that's necessary to actually drive the direction, because at the end of the day, it's the users, right? We started off with that comment, and so I think everybody learned from COVID that the user was needing something, whether it was at home for these Zoom calls or even just having some access. And I think there are goals that are being set by a lot of countries. I know here in Canada, we have a goal of 98% of the country having access to any kind of internet by 2026, and I think 100% by 2030. But again, people don't necessarily know what they can do with it. And so the education needs to be part of it. And then the private sector and the governments can help to facilitate and make these things happen. But I'm finding that in a lot of situations, we're not being transparent enough. We're not providing that open access to information about what this is all about to drive the broadband into those communities. And you guys are involved with satellites. And for many larger countries like Canada, that is going to have to be a part of the solution. And so it's not just fixed mobile, it also is satellite as part of this discussion.
And John, as you're saying, the tools are out there. It's just needing to know how you can access them, how you can use them for your benefit. And that's really done something, I think, that's created an opportunity that brings us to our last question that we have time for today. And that's the idea that these smaller communities, these maybe more rural communities, these mid-sized communities that previously could not participate as actively in that global economy, previously could not really compete with those bigger cities for talent and businesses. Broadband is equalizing that to an extent, and that's why our theme for this year's summit coming up on October 25th and 26th in New York City is "The Middle of Nowhere is No More." And I'm going to ask Lou Zacharilla to expand a little bit on that idea now and talk about those no-name communities, as they might be called, and why they might be the go-to places going forward. Lou, can you tell us a little bit about that?
No, well, more people live in those places, and I think more important, I think more people want to live in those places. I mean, if you were to ask me, would I like to be able to spend half of the year out in Long Island, where I have a home, or where I grew up in upstate New York, which was really a difficult place to live. It's one of the reasons I moved to New York. Absolutely, there was just never the type of infrastructure we've spent the last 30 minutes talking about that enabled me to go back up there. But what's really happening is, you've said, Matt, is we have made the middle of nowhere non-existent when we get the right kind of broadband in. So people now can live anywhere they want if they choose to. They don't have to be economic refugees. They can be refugees for adventure, to take their talents someplace, to live and have that experience. But they don't have to get kicked out of these places, which is essentially, been the story for the last several hundred years of the industrial age, or at least the last 100 or so. But I think finally on that, what's important is what John said, and we saw it in our Intelligent Community of the Year, New Taipei City, which will be in New York in October. Citizen first. Every technology, every app, everything they were doing with regard to the technology was enabling human beings to live their lives more fully in that city of, what was it? What, they got 4 million over there? I mean, everything. They were just thinking about the people first. I think when you start going down that path, no matter what the name of your city is, whether it's New Taipei City or Westerville or Curitiba, again, places most people haven't heard of, you're on the path to having a great place to live. And people are increasingly picking up on that. When you tell them you live in a big city like New York now, they're like, oh, gee, a lot of problems there, huh? I live in a nice community of 50,000. We love it here. So it's a very exciting age for the no-name city, for the non-marquee city, however we want to insult them and call them. But I think that's what's going on. That might be the biggest trend over the next 50 to 100 years.
Well, that's what COVID showed us, right? I mean, it's something that we believe very strongly here, that any community, pretty much anywhere, if they're properly connected and have the right kind of human and other assets, can have a very dynamic economy, right? And one that keeps the young people at home, that builds the future for them. But two points I want to make. One is, of course, not anybody can work anywhere, because the majority of jobs still require you to go to a place, whether it's a hospital, whether it's a factory, whether it's a retail store. Bodies are still required in different places. So it's not a magic solution. But the other part of that is just this sense that you can build the foundation of a high growth economy. I mean, it's interesting that if you think about what are the high growth places, it's all places that are extremely productive, and they tend to be places with a lot of digital investment. Companies companies invest a lot in digital are growing faster than all the other companies. So the same thing is true of places, right? And that's the foundation. And then on top of that, you build that diverse society with all kinds of different opportunities for people in all kinds of different occupations with different sets of skills. But you have to have that core. And it's a big challenge sometimes, particularly for small places. And the challenge is that, in a small place as opposed to a large city, your local government is small. And people are all juggling about 5 or 6 different functions in many cases. And they don't have a lot of time, and they don't have a lot of the luxury of a lot of training about how to do their jobs better. They're just trying to run the town or trying to run the city. And so one of the things that we really feel strongly about is the ability to educate people and say, look, you can do this. In fact, we'll show you how it was done by numerous places. And that's to us is a critical missing piece for the smaller to the mid-sized city to advance the way it could advance, given this amazing new infrastructure.
Yeah, but it assumes that you have some capability of keeping your talent home, because the real problem is these places have lost their talent, right? And when I look at Vietnam, when I got over there in Binh Duong, what I saw was young people coming back from all over the world because they saw something happening there, and so all this talent poured back in. But I have to ask the urban planner, John Jung. John, can you design the smaller place so that it is attractive, so that it is a place where these digital ecosystems, although I hate that phrase, but places where human beings can live their lives more fully?
Sure. And just before I do, I just want to react to Robert's comments. If you have the tools in a community, then it will be attractive for people. But just having the tools themselves is not enough. People need to have choice. And they're going to get together with other people who, in a big city center, I have a family member who's in the banking community. He wants to be close to the bankers and the financial industry that's really focused on in New York City. So he could have all the tools he wants, but he doesn't want to be in Rochester or Schenectady. He wants to be in Wall Street. And so you're going to get people who want to come together and who need to get together because of association, advancement, That's where the talent grows and gets a job placements and so forth. So it's about choice. And in free societies, we're always going to have cities that bring people together, and broadband isn't going to be the thing that makes that decision. However, there are lots of people who, given the opportunity, like Lou says, to go into an area that's not a big urban center and create very comfortable, livable communities, will be a great place to grow your family, grow your jobs, and so forth. There are tons of communities that are being designed right now as what are called smart cities, and there are some great models out there. I just did some research for another project that I did a while ago, and I thought about, looking at the future, what does a great model city look like? And I went to one of our intelligent communities of the year, Espoo in Finland, near Helsinki, and here was a 250,000 population community, but it was built on 5 pods. And I remembered going back into planning school that somebody somewhere had designed an idea of 50,000 people being sort of the ultimate goal of creating enough of a critical mass that it begets good entertainment, restaurants, reasonable infrastructure. You could have transit. You can do the 15-minute walking city thing. You can do all these things, bike trails and whatnot. You have enough people to be able to afford and to be able to have the decision making to create a wonderful community. And Espoo, when I went to it, it had 5 of those. An education hub, it had a retail hub, it had a tech hub, and I saw how people living around them, and they were broken up by green spaces, they were having a great time. And they were diverse. They were people from all over the world, not just from Finland itself. And I used that as a model to describe what I thought would be a fantastic community, generations from now. And as an urban planner, I always had in my mind that you can create these, and they do exist. And so I connected with people in a place called Innisfil, outside of Toronto, where there's a hub for transit being created there. And guess what? Innisfil is creating that 30 to 50,000 population smart city outside of Toronto. And we'll see what happens. It'll take all the lessons, and that's why they're interested in learning from us. They'll take best practices and the lessons from all over and apply them. And let's see what happens.
Yeah, John, and Innisfil really is, I think, one of those examples of those lesser known, I'm not going to call them a no-name community because they're not, but one of those lesser known, smaller, more rural communities that really is doing some very innovative stuff. I mean, if you look up a program called DMZ Innisfil and see what they're doing there, it's really some impressive stuff. They also were one of the first communities, at least first that I'm aware of, to actually start taking cryptocurrency for their property taxes. A pretty interesting risk that so far has paid off for them. And while I know we could continue going on about this topic and about broadband for, well, probably hours, and I know that because of how long I've worked with you guys, we are unfortunately out of time at this point. However, if you do want to hear more conversations like this, registration is now open for the ICF Summit. Again, that takes place on the 25th and 26th of October in New York City. You can go to icfsummit.com and take advantage of an early discounted registration fee at this time. But there's also going to be more conversations like this coming up, because over the next few weeks on our podcast, we're going to be featuring conversations from our recent Smart 21 conference and announcement with the focus of turning bits into coins. So we're talking about taking this broadband and how to actually get economic gain for your community out of that connectivity. You can learn more about ICF's programs and methods for helping cities by going to intelligentcommunity.org or following us on Twitter at New Communities, or on Facebook or LinkedIn by searching for the Intelligent Community Forum. For the Intelligent Community Forum and all of its co-founders, they were here with us today, Jung, Robert Bell, and Lou Zacharilla. I'm Matthew Owen, the Executive Director for ICF, reminding you there really is no place like home. Thanks, everyone.